Welcome to New West Press Audio, the official podcast of New West Press. I'm New West General Manager Matt Bose, and with me today is David Martin, author of the new poetry collection KINK Bands. How are you today, David?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
Yeah, good, good. It's beginning of fall season, so lots of stuff is happening. But yeah, all the books are in and looking good. So yeah, happy to be working another year at New West. But your new book, Kink Bands, is your second poetry collection, following up from Tar Swan, and it's got some similar things on its mind. It's got a kind of geological approach. Could you let our listeners know what Kink Bands is all about?
Sure. With the first collection, Tar Swan, that was more focused on the Alberta oil sands and kind of the strange history and mythology behind that place. And then this one is a little bit of a shift to more of a strictly geological approach, um, thinking about ideas of like deep time and seismic shifts and sort of studying the lithic record and then using that as a metaphor to think about different things like thinking of language in terms of a kind of layer, sort of digging into language and looking at these underlying layers of it. Also thinking about um, even sort of personal experiences with geological formations, going on trips with my family, um, and so that's another kind of difference with the previous book. There really wasn't very much David Martin in the Tar Swan story.
Yeah.
There's a bit more of a personal side to some of the poems in Kink Bands, which is different for me.
Yeah, I was wondering because, yeah, that first collection is like an epic, like the true poetic epic done with what, four major point of view characters? Three? There's
There's four.
the four, yeah. And I always kind of thought you might have identified with the engineer a bit, but it really feels like you're putting yourself more into this one. What's the experience of writing more of a personal collection while still very scientific, geological, etc., versus the epic form?
I think, well, it'll sound strange to most poets because for a lot of poets, they're kind of exploring their inner emotions and their experiences and thinking about the things that they've gone through and reflecting on them. So I know for some poets, it's a little odd when I say, um, this is something new that I'm doing, but it is, and it was kind of strange to be thinking about sharing more personal side to me, some family details, like family tragedies and things like that. So, and then suddenly I'm thinking about how other people might um, perceive those same events that they had lived through. I suppose with Tar Swan, there was a little bit of that because I had taken some real people, and so I could sort of wonder about the ethics of manipulating someone's life, but it was kind of outside of my personal experience. So I've been thinking about that a little bit. In Tar Swan, um, I think yeah, there's a little bit of identification with me with the archaeologist who's kind of digging into the past. That was also based a little bit on my friend and his experience as an archaeologist in northern Alberta, and then also a whole lot of fictional elements thrown in there because it gets a little strange.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but this was, I think, kink bands for me. It was a way to, uh, in some ways, be more experimental and even stranger than I was in Tar Swan, but also to be more kind of traditional and lyrical and thinking about my own experiences. So
Mm-hmm.
it was um, an interesting project for me to work on. I felt like it sort of pushed me in some new ways, um, and that I could sort of explore some new things in my writing that I haven't done before.
Yeah, Tarswan was very sort of regimented because each character, they had their specific place on the page where they were. They had it like every few poems, you would get a new one by this person. And they all had their kind of meter that marked them off as being there, like that character. But in this one, you've got a poem that goes horizontal, a poem that's just in the middle with like one word stanzas, or poems where it's kind of, you call it a plastic glomerate, where it's kind of falling down like the kink bands themselves. So, did you feel that you wanted to experiment with more textual form too, or is this kind of an outcropping, as it were, of kind of that regimented form, and you wanted to drill down and do even more concrete poetry?
There was definitely a sense of trying to explore kind of the physicality of the page, seeing what I could do, what sort of experiments would work. I like the idea of each poem maybe kind of doing something a little bit different. So one of them is read horizontally across the two pages, and one of the poems is a mathematical equation, and then there's a footnote, and then that's kind of the poem. But that footnote is shaped like the kink bands that it's sort of describing. And I think that kind of gets into one of the key things that I was trying to do in some of these poems, not all of them, is to enact some of the geological forces that I'm talking about, rather than just sort of discussing them in a poem. I wanted to see if I could enact them experimentally in a poem. So there's a couple of strange ones in there that I call metamorphic translations,
Yeah, I
and
was going to
those,
ask about those. Like
yeah,
like, because that's what basic English. It's 800 words or something, and then you also compressed it into essentially being a rock.
yeah. So in the first one, I take the first poem of the book, Plastic Conglomerate, and then I kind of subject it to sort of this heat and pressure, physically kind of smush it into a little rock or piece, which is what would happen with the metamorphic process for rocks. But also linguistically, I translated into this strange thing called Basic English, which was popular in the 1940s, and it was an alternate version of English that was restricted to 850 words. And I
Mhm.
liked the idea of subjecting my words to sort of that pressurized translation. So I called it a metamorphic translation, as kind of a physical representation, and just seeing what I can sort of push and apply to the poem.
Yeah, it feels like the 40s and the 50s, they were trying out weird global languages, universal languages. I also think about Esperanto, which you don't hear Esperanto anymore. But what is it about that period of time where people thought, okay, we're going to nail it down, just have like something that everyone can use. It'll be very user friendly, but also very strict. Like, how did you even come across basic English?
Well, Basic English is, I don't know how much we can talk about this, because this actually inspired my collection that's coming out next spring with the University of Calgary Press. So I don't know how much
Mm.
you want to talk about this, but I can briefly talk about it. Um, I came across it just on, I read books about like the history of English language, and someone was sort of making fun of this weird experiment that they had come up with. And to me, I thought it would be sort of a funny way to see if I could take a famous poem rendered in basic English to kind of show what this language can and cannot do. I kind of got carried away, and so it has now. I have like a whole collection of famous poems rendered in what I call New English, which is kind
Mm.
of taking the story of basic English and extending it into kind of a speculative fiction world where someone is going to be forced into using New English. They're going to have their memory erased, and to save this memory of the poems that they love, they have to translate them into this language of New English, this restricted language. So for the past few years, I had been kind of thinking about that and using it a lot. And then there was a couple of experiments where I wanted to see, can I use this in kink bands as well?
Sounds like something that would happen in a Rush album, I guess. It's also
Yeah,
very Orwellian. Just
yeah.
yeah, we're gonna control language down to its core. But well, Fahrenheit 451 too, where every person remembered the entire text of a book. I guess it'd be a lot easier if there was only 800 words total. So that's a. I'm not very good at remembering poems and things, so it makes a lot of sense to kind of cut it down that way. I
Orwell's
think.
Newspeak was kind of a response to Basic English about how
Mm,
he's kind of rebelling against it, and didn't he saw the tyranny of it, I guess.
Yeah, and he definitely won. Like people know what newspeak is, double speak. A
Yeah.
couple words from that book are common knowledge, but basic English, you're kind of pulling out of the depths of history, not really referred to that often. I think my favorite poem in the book is probably the funniest one. You're kind of taking a conversation between uh, Dwayne the Rock Johnson and Stone Cold Steve Austin and making it into almost Shakespearean English. Do you want to talk a little bit about that one, Rock and Stone Cold? That's a really funny one.
Sure. I don't know how I came up with that, but um, I guess there's sort of a technical difference between um, with geologists when they talk about a rock and when they talk about a stone. And for most
Mhm.
people, it's the same thing. A rock and a stone is the same thing. But for geologists, rock is sort of more found in its natural state, and a stone maybe has been transported or altered by human use or something like that. So I kind of like that idea. And then I just had this silly idea of the rock and stone cold Steve Austin. And I transcribed and as I was doing this, it's sort of the silliest thing in the world because I transcribe an entire conversation that they had during a WWE wrestling match where they're sort of yelling at each other. And then I decided, okay, that's going to be my lexicon. I can only use those words that they sort of yelled at each other. And then I want to use that um, as sort of this language for these two types of things that are similar, the rock and the stone, to kind of talk to each other and sort of almost explain the difference between the two. But they really don't like each other, I guess. So I don't know. It is a little silly. I think I had a friend who read that one, and he kind of liked it. But then he got to the end and he read the notes where I sort of explained what I did, and he was almost kind of mad at me. Like, what were you thinking?
I also really liked Nicholas Stino opens a door. Anytime the Medici's come up in a poem, I'm usually pretty happy. Do you want to talk a little bit about that one? Because it's a fun sort of like line scheme, and also I just the idea that someone would just mail you a shark is very charming.
And sure. So Nicholas Steno was a very famous, sort of considered almost the father of geology. He was a medieval monk, and famously, he was kind of torn between his religious convictions and the scientific discoveries that he was making. And so now, when people kind of look back at his work, different sides want to kind of claim them for their own. Um, and so he was making discoveries about like the age of the earth and the different strata and thinking about things like that. And actually, the first line, as strange as it sounds, Mr. Medici was kind enough to mail me a shark, is true. He was sent a fossilized shark by whichever Medici was in power at the time because they wanted him to sort of examine it. And then from then it gets a little weird where I have him sort of putting his head in the shark's mouth and kind of thinking about time and fossils and then how he will, in a way, he says, I'm going to be buried with this shark, but eventually, we'll turn into fossils and we'll kind of be raised up in some sort of like thrust fault, sort of risen up into the sky. And
Yeah, things get pushed to the surface over time. Isn't that the volcano, the kind of igneous rock? Like, oh, it's moving up again slowly, but it does.
yeah, when you have sort of two plates that collide, one can be sort of pulled underneath, one can be pushed up. That's how a lot of mountains are formed. And
Yeah.
so he's almost like kind of testing out those ideas by thinking that he's going to be buried with this shark. So it gets a little weird, but that first line is historically accurate. And there was a lot of debate at that time, like, well, what are fossils? And so there were
Hmm.
theories like maybe they've kind of fallen from the moon, or maybe the Earth just kind of naturally secretes these things that are fossils. So there was a lot of kind of wild theories about it, and that's another kind of aspect of the book is again sort of going into the history of geology and finding these um, often very strange ideas about what are mountains for, why were they created, what was the earth originally like. There's a poem called The Sacred Egg, and there was a theory that it was sort of a perfect sphere, but then it kind of cracked open, and that's how you sort of created oceans and mountains and things like that in sort of like a Christian fallen sense.
Hmm.
And so I was intrigued to kind of go back to these strange ideas about, you know, what mountains are, where fossils come from, and to sort of throw them all in there as, you know, part of this record of people thinking about the earth, thinking about rocks and the age of the earth, and that type of thing.
Yeah, it must have been kind of difficult when you're financially dependent on a patron and you have to kind of please them. Also, the church is involved, so you can't really say like, "Oh, there was dinosaurs millions of years ago. God's not real," etc. Like you might get in trouble for that. But you have to kind of invent these alternate theories. It's kind of a bit more art to that era of science, hey?
Yeah, yeah. There's been um there was the big debate in the early days of geologists around Darwin's time with Hutton and about the idea of the flood kind of shaping the world. And so there was
Hmm.
the idea of the uniformitarians, which is that the world has pretty much stayed the same for millions of years, that it makes these slow changes. And the people who believed in more like catastrophes, and that would make these sort of sudden changes to the world. And then what's kind of strange is when you get a little bit further along, once they start talking about um, glaciation and things like that, it's almost like some of the people sort of switch sides a little bit. So some of the geologists were like, well, no, I'm a uniformitarian. It really does have to take millions of years. And then some people would say like, yeah, but these glaciers in a very short time actually could make this huge geologic change across the surface of the world. And so I've been intrigued by the history of the debates in the science.
Hmm. Yeah, that reminds me of Tom Morton's ice fields, where I think it was something like the glaciers moved 2 inches a year or something, but in the ice age they were a lot more fluid, and nowadays they're moving in the wrong direction quite a bit. So, do you think that like geology, for example, is going to maybe benefit somewhat from climate change, and more things are going to be brought to light?
There's different discoveries that they can make. On Twitter, I follow this archaeological group that's finding Norse artifacts that are being discovered where glaciers have receded, and they can find clothing and things that have been preserved in the ice, which,
Hmm.
you know, wouldn't have been possible more recently. But in general, I think there's sort of this fear of the receding glaciers and what that's going to do to our water supply
Yeah.
and ocean levels and things like that. So I think geologists are involved in a lot of different discussions about the changing world.
Yeah, I just finished reading a book you might be interested in, William T. Volman's Imperial. It looks at the poorest county in California from time immemorial till the early 2000s, and it has a geological sense. It has a the different fruits that are grown there, different people that grew there, the religion, like basically anything he could possibly measure this one part of California, and he tried to. And I feel like the only thing he didn't do was poetry. And there's just kind of limits to nonfiction, right? Like you can look at every single chart ever, you can interview everybody, but there's always going to be a mediator who looks at something and just says it in an interesting new way, right?
Mm-hmm. That's kind
To
of
me,
what I
that
was
feels like
thinking.
the useful of poetry. Like you can, like that book was 1,200 pages long. It's good, but not everyone's able to do that. But you could write a poem about a certain part of the world and kind of distill it down into 1,200 words.
Yeah, I like that kind of crystalline distillation that a poem can bring across to sort of carry across ideas. And also, when I'm working on these poems, I'm usually kind of wondering like, well, why should this be a poem? Like if somebody is just
Mm-hmm.
interested in the history of geology or in geological facts or deep time, they'll go pick up like a nonfiction book or a scientific text. So what can I do with the language, with the kind of physicality of the page? What can I do as a poet to really make this worthwhile as a poem? So that's usually something that I'm kind of thinking about is like, why should this be a poem?
I think that's a great thing for everyone to just think about. Like, why am I doing this? Why is this form the one that would work for this? And you're also going back to the ancient scientists in, Greek and Roman times. Everything was kind of written in poetry at that time. So even if you wanted to get across your important theories and stuff, you still had to know how to use the common meter and rhyme of the time. Hey,
Right, to share your ideas. Yeah, that was sort of the form that was used.
so you're just
Uh,
bringing it back.
there's a poem in there that I use kind of Chaucerian language, and it relates like an idea about mountains and how this is from an even older idea from Pliny, Pliny the Elder, about how humans kind of have, this is his idea, humans sort of have domain over the whole world, but they should leave mountains alone. Like that's sort of the one area they
Hmm.
shouldn't mess with because that's kind of holding the earth together. And so it's the poem was sort of how can I explain that idea and talk about it a little bit, but also maybe do it in a form and a style that again is sort of pulled from the layer of language that maybe kind of going back and looking at things in a different way.
Yeah, kind of reminds me of the Shinto beliefs of like Tengu demon guys exist to defend the mountains of Japan against human interlopers. And when you think about glaciers and its stuff, like they're right. We did screw up the entire environment. We probably shouldn't have been involved in trying to create our own Anthropocene, but we did anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But you've got a selection of poems from the book to read for our listeners. Why don't you set that up?
Sure. I might just read one or two. The first one is kind of related to what we were just talking about, that kind of human intervention. It's a poem called Reunion, and it's about a concept called legacy pollutants. So there were chemicals that were used in the 20th century, like DDT, which eventually people realized were harmful and we stopped using them. But they had evaporated into the atmosphere, and some of them had precipitated into glaciers and were sort of frozen there. And now, as these glaciers are melting and receding, a number of these chemicals that we thought were gone forever are coming back to haunt us. So this is a poem called Reunion. We're closing in on the toe of Athabasca Glacier, trailing chatter marks and striations. The ice advances and recedes each day, smeared in rusty microbes that blunt albedo. This field is a pollutant cold storage, inheritance stilled in stunned whitecaps. Our tread marks sinter the snow, fusing flakes by evicting blisters of air. We sidestep moulins that seduce our path, striving to devour another hiker. Beneath the fern's seal, split leg molecules of DDT camouflage, sweating it out. Entombed in a wintry womb, these microscopic seeds pine to teem back into mainstreams. Prodigal isomers remind me this chemical bond is for life. Nerve signals crowed open, eggshells leached of calcium, sperm tranquilized, and cancer frenzied in the liver. When the ice at last ablates and meltwater punctures the terminal moraine's lip, human residues will lie as stowaways sown in outwash, nested in water tables. We stand on the frozen grade, knowing the next snowfall will scumble our tracks, while molecular scrimmage seethes in the glacial cage, primed to dog its way home. And maybe I'll just do one more. We were
Sure.
talking about the Nicholas Steno one, so I'll just grab that one. So this is called Nicholas Steno Opens a Door. Mr. Medici was kind enough to mail me a shark, and when I had fitted my head within its jaws, I saw its teeth were not strangers, like those feisty angles I tread upon when beach-bound. Whereas Pliny says fossils are tossed from the moon, and Kircher lectures they are geocosmic tears, I trust this beast could devour a mountain, play perpendicular with epochs to discipline me for silt rungs, pilot my pocket watch gears. I remove my mind from this mouth and chant. A carnivore is a door to our petrified future. Entombed upright, I'm sealed with a sleeping shark fostered in my arms to prove all that rises once laid down.
So you've got a few events coming up to promote kink bands. Why don't you let our audience know?
Well, this Thursday, September 21st, I'll be having the Calgary book launch at Shelf Life Books with special guest Samantha Jones, who I believe will be publishing a collection with New West Press next year, if I'm correct.
Yeah, I think it's next year. That's yeah, her Worry Maps collection, Attic Rain, I think it's called.
Attic Rain, yeah, that sounds right.
Yeah.
She actually has a tremendous geology background. That's what she studies. She's working on a PhD. So at some point when I had met her, I sent her my book to see what she thought, and she liked it. So I'm usually trying to get some professionals to make sure I'm not too far off.
Nice.
And then the following week, September 28th, I will be in Saskatoon. During the day, I'll be giving a little bit of a talk and lecture at the University of Saskatchewan to their creative writing department. And then in the evening, I will be giving a reading at McNally Robinson with special guest Sherry Benning. So I'm excited about that. And then the week after that, October 4th, I will be in Edmonton at Audrey's Books downtown with special guest Jaspreet Singh, who's also a New West author, and his collection came out last year, I believe, How to Hold a Pebble. And again, I've
Also
noticed,
very Anthropocene centric. Yeah, you got a lot of similar poets of late for us.
yeah, and I was at a reading with him, and we were kind of talking about, sort of different ideas, kind of mixing together and exploring things in some different ways. So I was
Hmm.
intrigued to meet him.
I think you're going to get along just fine.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks for coming on the show, David. Kink Bands is available in stores and online right now. Check the links in the show notes if you want to register for the events or just find out when they are. And thanks so much for coming on the show, David.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
And this is Matt Bose from New West Press Audio signing off.